tino, nau mai ki tēnei taumata kōrero o te wā. E pāna ki tō tātou nei taonga a Te Tiriti o Waitangi. E mihi ana ki Te Tiriti me ngā kaupapa kei mua. Nau mai korua, Aimee, korua ko te Aorangi. This is our time to have a talk about what I like to talk to the creators of this particular project, but also to get your understandings, your views, to talk about Te Tiriti within the context of philanthropy and how we can best lead, support, aki, hapai ake, the actual principles, not the legal, not the political, but the actual principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So nau mai ki tēnei kaupapa kōrero. I'm going to hand it over to you both to just introduce yourselves, the kōwai no here. But as part of that introduction piece, can you talk about the value of Te Tiriti o Waitangi within the context of your whānau, or the journey to Te Tiriti and that understanding that you have today within the context of your whānau? Ka pai? Kia ora.
Ka pai.
Kei a koe, Aimmee.
Kia ora. Tēnei te mihi ki a koe, I Kate. Ko wai au, heuri tēnei no ngā tahutu haurangi ngā te whakaue me ngā puhi hoki. Ko Aimmee Kaio tōku ingoa. So my papa is from Ngāpuhi. He was part of the Ocean Beach migration. As a teenager, came to Bluff to work at Ocean Beach, and he married my mother, who is of Ngaitahu and Te Arawa descent. So her mother is from Te Roroa Te Rangi, Ngā Te Whakaue, Rotorua, and Whakarewarewa to Haurangi. But I have been born and raised in the Bluff. Te Tiriti and the value of Te Tiriti in my whānau. So we, being born and raised in Bluff, we have Ruapuke Island just across the strait. We're very familiar with our connection to that place, and to Hawaii, and the signing of Te Tiriti has always been part of our narrative, our history, our whakapapa. But it probably wasn't until I got to university to really understand the why we signed it, who we were as a people at that point in time. And yeah, fast forward, rewind. So we knew about that narrative, that it happened in that place, and there was this thing called Te Tiriti. But during even at our marae, through schooling, etc., Te Tiriti wasn't it wasn't a thing that we talked about, and it wasn't a thing that was part of our everyday conversations. But we did know that it was an important part of our whakapapa and our history down in that place. I think when I got to university, a lot of things made sense to me in terms of why Te Hawaii signed it. So, in our narrative, he rocked up in British uniform attire. He was being very sophisticated, and he was quite prepared. They say he was quite prepared, but he was signing it because he was already no stranger to colonization, because we were trading in the early 1800s, like internationally. We had the sealers and whalers, etc. He was already observing the impact and the influence of colonization and therefore he wanted to protect his people and his whenua and their tikanga. There's a lot of journals that talks about our tikanga being lost, different ways of being and living were being introduced into the communities. And even though we didn't speak about Te Tiriti, or colonisation was never a word in my upbringing, the loss of tikanga, different ways of practicing, the influence of sealers and whalers, and we're all products, a product of that whānau too. We talked about the influences of those times and those changing times, but it wasn't specifically Te Tiriti. So sorry, I'm rambling, but when I got to university, I kind of took a bit more of a deep dive of why our rangatira signed it, and for the purposes of what he was trying to protect. He was already observing colonisation and then just tracking through how we've progressed as a people from that time to when I was at university through to today. So it holds great value and great significance to my whānau, but we didn't explicitly talk about Te Tiriti, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Absolutely does. I think it resounds with a lot of the kōrero we've had with our other contributors and participants. We have some that say, Waitangi is going to go get pippies. We're going to get pippies. It's where we have our whānau days without the technical aspects of Te Tiriti or understanding the impacts wholly. If anything, these conversations, if they can be called that, over the last few months that the nation has been having, has at least allowed for a deeper dive into the whole concept of Te Tiriti or the treaty, whichever. So absolutely, Aimee, it makes absolute sense. And you've got to go backwards to go forwards, to go backwards to put yourself in that context and the things that you've learned around Te Tiriti. So kia koe hoa. How about you, Te Aorangi?
Kia ora tātou. E tautoko ana I ngā mihi ki a koe e te whaia mau I whakataki I tā tātou hui te rangi nei. I guess in terms of my journey with Te Tiriti, I'll probably come a little bit more present day. My mum is from Te Wairarapa, so no Ngāti Kahungunu ki Te Wairarapa, no Ngaitahu, no Ngāti Apa, no Hoki. But we've been living in Whakatāne for a long time, and she married a Pākehā. Mark is his name. And so I see that as probably a very real representation of a treaty partnership in terms of how they brought myself up and how they brought my siblings up as well. Right back from early days through until being homeschooled, and I think I can kind of draw lots of parallels between how a relationship like that in a marriage and how that relates with what we might consider a good treaty partnership, because it's not like you all have to, you both have to do all of the things all of the time. And so I think, when I think about how we were schooled, it might have been my mum might have set the curriculum, Papa might have delivered it, and in the other instances, Mama might have been more present in other areas of my life when Papa wasn't. So, and I think if I take that and use that as an analogy for a treaty partnership, whether we're considering core government department, whether we're considering philanthropy, community trusts, funders, it's not like you both have to do all of the things all the time, and I can kind of draw parallels between that and a marriage. So yeah, tēnā tātou katoa.
Te katau. I had very similar kōrero to that. My mother, who's hardcore Scots-Irish from the Bluff, was very conscious of Te Tiriti back in the 80s and integrated it into her teacher training curriculum when no one else would. And then she decided she would always teach Pākehā about Te Tiriti. Whereas Dad would talk about the purepo that we stole off the British at Ruapekapeka, as we still got one in our wāhi tapu and another one at Ruapekapeka, and tell the hard case stories of that time. So I do understand that. Kia ora, Te Aorangi. it makes for a really rich, relationship amongst whānau.
And I guess just to acknowledge as well, it's not, we weren't necessarily explicitly taught about this is the Treaty of Waitangi, or this is Te Tiriti or Waitangi, and this is exactly what the provisions of it were. But, as in terms of growing up and seeing that unfold, and as I came to understand a lot more around the history, particularly of my own iwi and hapu and the relationship with the Crown and how that's evolved over time, it's that's probably how I came to be a little bit more acquainted with what Te Tiriti is and the actual importance of it as a foundational document in Aotearoa.
And so the two of you led out the project, Te Tiriti or Waitangi resource with the Centre for Social Impact, because for funders and others who are trying to find ways to honour or trying to find ways to give effect to and to understand better what power sharing can look like. When we share power, it just gives everybody more power. So, and having that aspect kind of weave through our mahi, why this resource at this time for you both?
I can probably talk to that initially. I guess from my own experience being on a community trust, it's and also being connected with what other community trusts are doing around the country, it was really clear that we're at a stage now where most of the community trusts, if not all of them, have this treaty clause included in their deeds, right? And at the very kind of high level governance policy documentation, you've got kind of Te Tiriti weaved throughout that. And I guess for the trust that I sit on, the question was more, okay, now that we've got that kind of clause ingrained in our deed, and it's it's kind of slowly filtered through all of our policy documents, how do you actually put that into practice? How do you operationalize that? And I guess this resource was a way of being able to show some really clear guidance on, and really real world examples on how you can actually demonstrate a Te Tiriti honouring relationship. And so I guess that for me, it's taking it purely from a clause or some words on a bit of paper to actually operationalizing it within the community, and that includes both in all aspects of the role that community trusts play. And I think we often think that community trusts are purely there to give money, and that's not necessarily always the case. You've got the investment side of the balance sheet, you've got the granting side of the balance sheet, you've got advocacy, you've got a whole lot of other areas that community trusts play a role in. So it's understanding, across all of those areas and all of the different roles that a community trust or a trust like this might play in the community. It's understanding how do you actually give effect to some of these clauses within that.
Well done. And sometimes it's almost people forget that maybe working, your kaupapa might be the community trust, but we're also community members.
Absolutely.
We're community members too. We belong to clubs, we can play sport, we fall over and dust ourselves off, just like everybody else. And I think that's something to remember, because this is I noticed for our interviewees, that's the right word, I really want to acknowledge their generosity and what they shared in those interviews, because what they contributed was, some of it was really vulnerable. They were sharing how they're learning alongside of community, alongside of mana i te whenua. They were sharing moments of falling over and getting up, dusting off and trying again moments as they come to learn about Te Tiriti within the context of Aotearoa New Zealand today. And so I really want to mihi to everybody that's contributed to this particular kaupapa, but especially to the both of you who are the authors of it all. So like you said, Te Aorangi, a lot of the community trusts have a Te Tiriti clause embedded in their deeds now, and we're looking to transform into practice that's real and pragmatic. What are some of the community trusts that you've seen, and in both of your experiences, we'll start with you, Aimee, what have you seen them do well? What have you seen our whānau and murihuku doing well, Aimee?
Yeah, so firstly, their acknowledgement of Te Tiriti or Waitangi and what it means. I can also recall a hui that we had where we had a discussion and kind of unpacked Te Tiriti in action, if you like, for within Murihiku, that, you know, who would we be as a community and as a whānau if there was no Te Tiriti? So, you know, holding local government to account and resource management, and te mana o te wai, all of those types of things. So we had a bit of a discussion of the, you know, what if we didn't have a Te Tiriti, and then brought it back to why Te Tiriti or Waitangi is so important in the philanthropic sector, and therefore why it's so important to community trust. So there was what I admire about the team and the board, all of the members that have been, you know, past and present, and a real acknowledgement of Te Tiriti and the value it has for who we are as a community trust. What we have done very well down in Murihiku is had a very strong relationship with mana whenua, with our papatipurunanga. So there's 4 papatipurunanga down in that rohe, and also with our mātāwaka whānau. So we have a number of other marae and Māori communities that, you know, are in the whānau as well. Yeah.
That's us.
And there has been a different way of working with mana whenua in terms of co-investing in kaupapa. So there's an annual commitment to work with papatipurunanga individually on certain kaupapa that the papatipu want to drive and lead for better outcomes for Māori. So, you know, and that was touted by the community trust team. We have a papatipurunanga nominated representative seat on the board, so that's written within our rules. So yeah, I'm very proud of Murihiku. Your sister, actually, Katie Mata, she was the bold chair and the real champion to implement those 2 kaupapa that I mentioned earlier, but also she worked really hard on demystifying a whole lot of myths, if you like, for our Pākehā whānau, for our board members and for our team around engaging with Māori and you know, what we stand for and what are Māori-led solutions and approaches and why they're amazing and all these types of things. So yeah, very big mihi to your sister. Yeah, I think all of our community trusts are on their journey. And I've said there's lots of beautiful examples of Te Tiriti in action across the community trusts in Aotearoa. I'll just stick to there.
Well, kia ora, I just want to acknowledge, though, the fact that that value of reciprocity of tau to the life and well, because as Māori communities, it's not always about money. It's about those co-investment opportunities where we can really create impact and accelerate or just, yeah, well, accelerate kaupapa and deepen them together. And a lot of the relationships, what we're finding, they're not about money. They are to be nurtured. You can have your ups and downs like you do in any relationship, but it's the resource itself is in whakaro, and it's in learning, it's in sharing, but it's not always about putea. And when you shared that before about the co-investment opportunities, that's what it means, and I'm just so grateful for that. And just to also acknowledge that we are very, very blessed as a mātāwaka whānau, as a kutahere, to have been raised by Kati Moe. So, Aimmee, ka whakahoki te mihi kia koutou i te whānau. Te Aorangi, how about your experiences?
I think just to acknowledge also that, I think it's a really good point you bring up around it not always being just purely about money, but I think you've also got to acknowledge, and this is not the case just for Māori in the community, but most people who hold a relationship with a community trust probably do so because the community trust has money to give.
Yes.
And it's to understand that while the community trust can give money, there's also more that a community trust can give as well to support Māori aspiration and Māori aspirations. And it's just acknowledging that money is part of it, and it's it's often the base for a lot of what we do, but it's the role that a community trust can play, particularly in supporting Māori aspirations, broader than that. I don't necessarily want to highlight a single kind of example because I think there's lots that have been covered in the interviews, with Trust Waikato and Toi Foundation, and even what J.R. McKenzie have done. I know they sit slightly outside the kind of Community Trust Act and framework, but still very much an very important funder in Aotearoa. But I think we've seen really good examples, and I think some of the more beneficial ones are the ones that are a bit more long term, where they're kind of ingrained with how each other operates now. And I kind of use, whether it's the Trust Waikato example and the Kingitanga, or what Toi Foundation have done in Taranaki, or what Foundation North have done with Ngāti Whātua. It's not hard to find some really good examples of what a really valuable treaty partnership looks like, and I think it's just the important thing. Important part of it is understanding that there is a role for community trusts to play in supporting Māori aspirations, but also acknowledging that it's not just a matter of community trust just turning up and saying, okay, we want a relationship with you now. Are you interested? Because that's not how it always works. I guess coming back to that kind of, it probably doesn't work in a marriage either. So if I use that kind of analogy I did earlier, it probably doesn't work. So if you think of it maybe a little bit like that, it might be a good way to look at it. But and we're really lucky that there aren't any. It's not hard to find some really good examples of that kind of treaty partnership in play.
Right, and also our relationships can be evolving, nurtured. They can evolve quite naturally. It can be quite organic, and at times we need to remember we're not Crown entities.
Yeah.
There's not set processes that must be, through a red book or through some kind of Crown, Māori relationship pathway. That actually within community trust, because we are of community, we can have quite different, they can be very genuine, they can have time invested into those relationships in a different way. I think something to really highlight with anyone that's watching this is that we're not talking Crown Māori relationships here. We're a genuine community relationship with Te Tiriti as a foundation, because they're awesome principles.
Yeah.
Like I said, we're informed ourselves at the start. This is not legal, political principles. We're talking about real community values of participation, of protecting our land and our whānau and our waterways. Those are genuine things. Those are values that are shared across humanity, eh?
I guess that's where the value in community trust, and just to pick up on your point, you did right that community trust can be slightly more flexible than what, your kind of core government departments who Crown entities and whatnot, in terms of how it funds, how it looks after the community. And so, there's kind of no excuse for community trust to enact those principles, whether it's the 3 Ps or whatever kind of treaty principles you abide by. There's kind of no headache or no ties around how community trusts may give effect to some of that, and I think that's part of the while we may see the legislation that governs community trust, while we may see that as a little bit of a little bit annoying at times, maybe there's actually a lot of wiggle room within that to be flexible, more so than what maybe other funders or other public sector entities can be.
That's right.
Yeah, and I think the beauty of the community trust too is they can be innovative, they can be bold in leadership in their communities, advocacy, etc. The examples of co-investment across Aotearoa between community trusts and iwi, I know that there are corporates and government looking at those examples and saying, oh, how can we participate? So, you know, they're, what's the saying? They hold the door open. They're always holding that door open. And I think we're very lucky that the community trusts can be innovative in that space.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think, you know, community trust is quite a unique setup, the whole community trust thing in Aotearoa, right? Compared to what you might see in other parts of the world. And I think, you know, just coming back to the value of the treaty, I think one of the things that makes our community trust network different from any other community trust network around the world, and I often think this, you know, what is it that makes Foundation North, or what is it that makes Bay Trust or Trust Waikato or Community Trust South different from any other kind of community trust around the world? You know, a large part of that is the kind of bicultural foundation that we're found upon. Obviously, you know, built on Te Tiriti or Waitangi. So it's, you know, we're relatively unique in that sense.
So on that, what are some things that we can consider as community trusts to better inform our practice? What are some of the things we can do to better inform and to improve upon over the next few years in terms of our Te Tiriti or Waitangi journey, and giving effect and honouring and practicing, and some other things that we could consider?
It's a really good question. It's not an easy one to answer. I think, you know, there are implications at all levels, right? There's governance level implication, there are implications, there are kind of operational level implications. You know, if you kind of look at the governance level, yeah, I assume, you know, relatively most community trusts have probably taken care of the policy stuff, or if they haven't fully done it, you know, they're kind of getting through that process. I think where it moves to after this is, you know, actually fostering meaningful relationships with Māori, and I'm not just saying runanga. I know for some, obviously, the runanga is an easy way to form a relationship with the Māori communities, but it's also understanding that there are other kaupapa Māori organisations out there. So I think it comes down to relationships. It comes down to things like what sort of data you might know, or what data you hold, or what you know in terms of information about Māori communities. Often we're trying to make decisions at a community trust level, you know, the kind of board level, about things that we don't know a lot of information about. And it's been a real work on for some community trusts, I know. And then right through to the operational stuff, and that might include, you know, who you have in your team, whether they're able to hold mana-to-mana relationships, all of that sort of stuff. So it's really across both the board and the operational side of it. But I think the board really does have to take the lead on it and initiate a lot of that.
Yeah. But you, Aimmee?
Yeah, for me, I think always keeping front of mind iwi and Māori, we are here forever. So, you know, always consider that intergenerational lens. Also understand the history and the impact of that history on your community. You know, colonisation created the inequities that philanthropy seeks to address. So I think it's really important that at a board level, you know, we understand all of those implications as to why our communities face the challenges that they have, but then also, you know, what is the innovation or the beautiful opportunities that we can also harness with iwi, with Māori in your community. yeah, I think those are, that's what I used to drill with my board all the time. Yeah, just learn from the past for us to move well into the future for better outcomes for our people, for everybody in our community. And yeah, and then I always go back to who are we as a people if we did not have Te Tiriti o Waitangi as our foundational document, all these beautiful principles within our deed. Yeah, which kind of, yeah, brings us back to our role as community trusts and yeah, in the philanthropic sector, what value we can add.
Well done. I'm thinking of, there's some sayings that came out of Alaska and have been adopted here. You know, be that good ancestor, be a good ancestor. And then we hear a lot about mokopuna decisions. And so just for a little light-hearted question, you know, not that we've stretched your brain at all today, but thinking about 2050, and I'll be at least 50, no, I'll be 80 by then. 2050, and you'll be taking care of me, Aimmee. What is your vision for that 2050 Aotearoa New Zealand in regards to Te Tiriti and within the context of our roles where we get to have the privilege of being generous and giving?
You go first, Aimmee.
Yeah. I would love for all of us for Te Tiriti to be, it's already normalised. So we live and breathe the intent, the values, the practices that Te Tiriti has paved the way for us, and it's just normalised. We don't have to talk about Te Tiriti and Te Tiriti principles. It is normalised. It is who we are as a people, as Aotearoa. 2050, yes, I think there'll still be challenges and things, but we're working really strong together collectively to ensure yeah, we support our communities to adapt and to be in healthy and thriving communities. So that's a real moimoia, but yeah, for it to be normalised. Yeah.
I think you make a really good point there around, you know, actually we're getting to a point in time where we're not actually talking about it. And I think, you know, it's the same, you know, we talk about this all the time with Te Reo Māori. It's like we're always talking about the language, but not talking the language. And, you know, ideally you want to get to a point where you're just talking the language, you don't actually have to talk about it. And whether we get to that stage in 2050, by 2050 or not, but I kind of think one thing to acknowledge as well is that a lot of the strategies and whatnot that community trusts have are probably on the right track. You know, when I look around, a lot of the visions and a lot of the kind of the strategy documents and whatnot that community trusts have, I think most of us would probably agree that that's, you know, if we ever get to a point in time where we've realized those strategies or realized those visions, probably a good place to be. It's just that, you know, it's easy to kind of overestimate how much things can change. And I know things can change a lot in 25 years, but it's also easy to overestimate how much they can change, particularly when they, you know, particularly when you think, you know, we've almost been 200 years since Te Tiriti. And, you know, so it's probably going to take a long, you know, time before we get to, you know, to the point where we've actually embodied what we're talking about. So, but it's just I just want to acknowledge as well that, you know, I think, you know, relatively we're probably on the right track. It's just, it's going to take time.
That was a perfect way to finish up that kind of little session there. I mean, we do, because of our whakapapa and who we are, we do get to think intergenerationally. So it should have been an easy question to answer.
Yeah.
So You know, I guess, and to finish us up, I'm noting, you know, there is a lot of attention right now as we're having these conversations that surface Te Tiriti o Waitangi in the treaty, and dealing with that tension and how we keep ourselves well as we go through that. What do you think some of the next steps could be in terms of the resource that we've journeyed with so far? What do you think we could be doing next in terms of helping our philanthropic community?
That's a really good question. I think just to start it off, yeah, I think it's really important that you do understand, you know, our past in order to understand why we're having a lot of the conversations that we're having today, whether it's politics, whether it's, you know, legal conversations, whether it's the conversation that we're having today. And I think where it becomes a little bit difficult sometimes is when you read you know, when talking about, you know, information, when you start reading it, you know, what's kind of trustworthy, what's credible, what to believe and what not to. Because obviously, you know, what kind of feeds our views and, you know, fuels our kind of ideologies and whatnot around what we're discussing, you know, present day is the information that we consume. And so I think in terms of advancing a kaupapa like what we've started here with the treaty resource, something around you know, information, misinformation, disinformation might be a good way to go.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I agree. And just leading on from that, you know, how do we call out the myths? How do we, you know, when we hear them, how do we call it out? With manaakitanga, of course. And I think then that goes back to supporting our whānau to check their sources of information. I think that's a key one too. You know, where are we sourcing this misinformation and disinformation from? And yeah, encouraging open dialogue is important. Open and respectful kōrero, creating spaces where there are no dumb questions. I think there is a tension that some of us find it difficult to articulate. Like you can feel validity, you can feel it, but you can't quite articulate what these tensions are around Te Tiriti and within this political space we find ourselves in at the moment, etc. So I'm a real advocate for having more open kōrero, again, with manaakitanga. So yes, if you could create that, Katie, that would be amazing.
Slip that in there. I would love to work alongside you both. I will follow you both anywhere. I was Aimee ana.
Tēnā koe.
She's frozen.
Oh, you might have frozen there. You might have
I'm
cut
back.
that out.
Here I'm back.
Okay.
Oh, it's saying I'm unstable. I'm not sure if it's my internet or me.
Hopefully the internet.
I believe it's the internet. But I was just saying, kua tutuki noa. Kua tutuki noa, tātihini ngaro, tāti ngākau, tā ngā whakawhitinga kōrero, ngā whakawhitinga whakaro o te wā. You know, tukuna tātou, you know, kia haere I nai nei. Thank you so very much for your generosity and giving of time this afternoon to have this kōrero. Clearly, in terms of the resource, we've still got some ways to go and we should just haere tonu, me haere tonu. And thank you for your power pearls of wisdom that were dropped today. The last 10 minutes especially, I think will be very, I'm going to come back and listen and learn again. And I think we've got calling out the myths with manaakitanga. I like that as a, as a top. So tēnā kōrua.